Okay, welcome to Chapter 12. This is the last chapter in the book. So this is on maintenance. Now, maintenance is not really the right term. I would call this like operations, things that have to do to sustain things. Maintenance is a poor word. Anyway, learning objectives, discuss the ongoing maintenance and information. Yep. The security model maintenance. Identify the key factors in monitoring, make sure the due diligence part. Describe how planning risk assessment, vulnerabilities, etc. Explain how building readiness and review procedures in, and discuss physical security controls. Okay, so the opening case is kind of a weird one. They're getting ready to deploy this thing. They're down to the wire. They're deploying it almost immediately, and dang, something shows up on bug track that says, we found a vulnerability in this open source software. You need to make some tweaks. It's like, anyway, make some last minute changes. And then there's other things about, should we go through the whole review process over? Should we just patch and forget? Okay, so introduction, page 448, they talk about, after you've done the implementation and testing, the initial testing, then you have an awful lot of tasks associated with maintenance. Okay, so some of these tasks are pretty simple. Things can change, right? You could have 100 employees and then you have 200 employees, that kind of stuff. New hardware, new versions of software comes out, new policies. What about new employees? During the implementation and testing phase, that's where you trained all your existing employees. But you're going to have something in place for a new employee who wasn't on board when that thing was implemented. So yeah, you're going to need an awful lot of stuff. So lack of maintenance, basically means let's look for a replacement. That's what lack of maintenance means. In other words, if you don't do anything at all, you just basically say, well, I'm going to replace it next year anyway, so I'm done. However smart that is, you might disagree. So there are some maintenance models. Of course there's models. Page 449. It's just like a framework like everything else we've done. Just like, the risk models in Chapter 4. It's the same thing. So remember now, maintenance typically has its own life cycle. You start something up and then you go through and, it's an entire procedure about making changes and making sure it's assessed, etc. So there's a NIST guide in there, a guide for managers. It's in supplemental materials. And they talk about the governance one more time, about, ongoing activities associated with this. So, plans and actions and milestones and measurements and metrics. You need to be able to see if, from due diligence perspective, you need to make sure that things are accurate, measure it, see if it does what you said it was supposed to do. Continuous assessment, or what most people call continuous improvement. In other words, we're currently doing this, but if we tweak a little bit, we can reduce the error rate, as an example. Configuration management, every single change that happens to the system really ought to go through a rather rigorous set of rules to make sure that this change doesn't affect something else. And then monitoring, and then incident response thing. You got to have statistics on the number of attempted break-ins, for example, to find out how effective your tools are. Okay, now we mentioned before when we were talking about project management that, make sure everyone knows what tasks that are assigned to them. Who's doing the plans, who's doing the measurements, who's doing configuration management, who's doing network monitoring, who's doing, incident statistics. Somebody has to be in charge of all that. Okay, good. So the system development lifecycle, this is the thing that's from the other NIST document. Mostly a repeat from Chapter 11, so we're going to kind of move on. So configuration and change management is one of the ones that's kind of different from the previous. And again, I mentioned this when we talked about this in a little bit more detail, that this is not something where you just say, oh yeah, Bob's not busy, we'll make him do change management. No, it's got to be, it can't just be, other duties as assigned. It really has to be something that's thought out. Somebody gets assigned the job. And remember, one of the reasons why you should have a configuration control board is because if something goes wrong, then you can fall back to the board and say, it wasn't me. the board approved this change, right? Remember all that? Good. So awareness and training, like from Chapter 3, yep, it's an awful lot of stuff like that. That kind of makes sense. You could like record your courses, like kind of sort of like what we're doing. And, find out who's in attendance, the dates, make sure you have a sign-in roster, all that stuff. And then maybe there's going to be a test at the end where there's scores. You test your employees to see if they were actually paying attention, and you kind of use that in your due diligence. You're like, okay, the scores are increasing, which means we're doing a good job of the SATA program. Capital planning. Okay, now this is more like, finance kind of stuff. I need to buy new equipment or replace the old one, that kind of thing. And so, the budget folks need to understand the sense of urgency. Sense of urgency might be incredibly obvious to you, okay? Let's say, for example, you only have one server that does your customer-facing data, okay? And someone says, well, that's a pretty dumb idea. You probably need to have redundancy there. I mean, there's an awful lot of risk in that one machine going down and not having another one up. And so to you, it's like incredibly obvious that I need redundancy. But, a finance person is going to be, wait, we just spent $15,000 on a server and you want another one? They're not, the sense of urgency is not going to go across. So, again, you're not going to be able to do everything, so you need a prioritized list of requirements and supporting materials that other people, other than security people, are going to nod their head and go, aha. And the way I always couch it is that whole business continuity thing. It's like, tell me how long you can go without this thing running. And if the answer is 4 hours, well, then I'll just turn around and go, I'll walk away and I'm done. But if you say it's 10 minutes, well, then we're going to have to spend some money to get there, right? Okay, good. So some people have like an investment review board, because all capital costs are all, everybody's competing against capital. Somebody wants to expand the factory, and somebody else wants to, do something else over here and buy more equipment. But you have to compete against all that. The interconnection systems. So, during planning, you talk about, okay, now this system has to be able to talk to that system, maybe inside the same company, but maybe not. It could be something else. But then you have to plan it, test it, and maintain it. I had a scenario not too long ago where we needed to be able to pull some data from this one system. And so we were using one person's credentials because it really wasn't designed from machine to machine. Okay, they wouldn't give us a machine account. So we just used one person's account. And in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning, it would use their credentials to go pull this data from their system and put it into our system. Worked great until that guy decides to leave, right? Okay, so somebody needs to know what the plan is. Somebody needs to be able to test this. Someone needs to be able to maintain it. Particularly if they say, well, we're going to go to two-factor authentication. Well, that's going to be a little tough to automate. And then performance management. Okay, so before you can say that the performance has degraded, you need a baseline. I need to be able to know what the normal activity is. Let's just say I have a database server for an e-commerce website. I need to be able to say, okay, the average amount of time it takes for someone to, when they hit the buy button before it comes back and says, receive is, 3 seconds. And you think, that's okay. I mean, somebody pushes the button, they're not going to panic in 3 seconds thinking the machine's locked up. But if it goes to 15 seconds, they're going to go, hey, what's going on? Hey, all right. So you need to be able to say, here's our baseline, and then track it over time to be able to say, okay, this is reaching the point where it's unacceptable. We need to spend money now. Okay, remember all that? Good, okay. So you need a performance baseline. Effectiveness of the policy might be a performance baseline. Services, incident response. There's a lot of things that could have, a baseline, and then you track the performance of. Incident response. How long did it take for people to show up? And, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Anyway, so there's some really cool measures they throw in here. Talks about the things you ought to be measuring. some of these are kind of wild, like stakeholder interest. I don't know how you measure that. Goals and objectives, yeah. Security information policy, yeah. Information security program implementation, level of implementation, program results, business impact. Hopefully, this is not just cost avoidance, but you'd end up with the business value gained or lost, and the acceptable loss estimate, and timeliness of these devices, and operational results, and implementation level. You could say, we're not fully there yet. We haven't fully implemented our entire system. We don't have enough money in the world, but we're halfway through, right? That's what that yellow part is about. Anyway, so this basically requires like strong support, that makes sense. And there's some practical, policies and procedures to make this thing happen. So they talk about, again, the quantifiable measures one more time, things you ought to be kind of paying attention to. This is kind of a, key performance indicators, if you're one of those kind of people, KPIs. So my measurement field might, like, for example, in this case, security training coverage. So everyone should have it. Well, by the way, maybe not. Does the guard force, contracted out guard force, or the contracted out custodial, or the contracted out maintenance, do they need it? Maybe, maybe not. And what is the goal? I have a strategic goal and a more tactical goal. And what am I measuring? It's the percent of InfoSec personnel that receive security training. How do I measure it? Why, by just implementing the thing. And what's the formula? Well, there's no real formula. It's, the sum of the number of people divided by the number of people, right? The target is 100%. And then, implementation evidence, there are no significant, how frequency, I would probably, collected as training is delivered. Remember now, initial training probably took place during the other phase. This is about new employees coming in and periodic things happening. I mentioned to you guys that I still, every year, I have to go through a security risk assessment training by virtue of being a professor at the university. Again, they have no idea that I'm teaching these courses, but, hey, that's okay. So this is just an example of, who's supposed, and of course, responsible. I love that one. Who's the owner, who does the collecting, and who basically is the customer for the answer, right? This is important. Without the responsible parties, you just can't wave your hand and say, oh yeah, this needs to be done. You got to say, Bob, you're in charge of this. Sally, you're in charge of that. Okay. We've seen all this before. Okay. So they talk about results-oriented analysis. This is a little buzzwordy, I'll confess. But basically they're talking about, prepare for collecting your data, identifying any corrective actions, developing a business case, obtaining resources, and applying the thing, and just go through again. So this is essentially the same thing as, gathering information, analyzing, implementing, looking to see, and, making changes. It's a continuous life cycle thing. Implementation measurement, as they call it. Okay, so security planning from Chapter 3. They got the tactical, strategic, operational, right? All those kind of things. All that stuff should be in here. And you should be able to say, from our strategic plan, how far have we gotten? From our tactical plan, how far have we gotten? And from, operational, almost always is going to be already done. At least I would hope it would be. And then IT contingency planning. Basically, this is the stuff from Chapter 5, right? The plans must be current. And, I mentioned that, the call-out roster story about if you think that the call-out roster is good because you send it out to everyone saying, make sure you update your data. You think that's going to be sufficient? Boy, you're in for a rude awakening. That is not at all how it works. The only way to find out is to wait some weekend and start calling and see who answers the phone. Yeah. Okay. So personnel changes, right? There's lots of things that could happen in that space. Swap people out and don't even know it. I'm calling somebody who retired last year. Come on. Man, I've seen a lot. So let me tell you, this one is not exactly clear. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark.